The dust kicked up around Martha Reynolds's worn boots as she stepped onto the main street of Rawlins, Wyoming, carrying 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, and she could already feel the familiar weight of dozens of judgmental eyes boring into her back on this sweltering afternoon in July of 1878. At 20 years old, she had been a widow for 8 months now, ever since Thomas Reynolds had died from pneumonia during the brutal winter, leaving her alone with nothing but debts and a small rented room above the general store where she worked to pay for her keep. The whispers followed her everywhere she went in this unforgiving town, a constant reminder that she was different, somehow tainted by tragedy at such a young age when most women her age were just getting married or starting families with healthy husbands by their sides. She had loved Thomas with all her heart, though their marriage had lasted only 14 months before death claimed him at the age of 23. He had been kind and gentle, a dreamer who wanted to start a cattle ranch but never quite managed to save enough money before the illness took him. Now Martha lived in a strange limbo, neither maiden nor wife, and the people of Rawlins seemed determined to make her pay for that ambiguous status with their cruel words and cold shoulders. "There goes the widow Reynolds, Mrs. Hutchinson said loudly enough for Martha to hear as she passed by the seamstress shop. 20 years old and already used up. What man would want her now? Martha kept her head high and her steps steady, though the words stung like a slap across the face. She had learned not to respond, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. The buckets felt heavier with each step, the rope handles cutting into her palms, but she refused to show weakness. That would only give them more ammunition. "I heard she cannot even afford proper morning clothes," another voice chimed in, belonging to Miss Penelope Garrett, the banker's daughter who had never worked a day in her privileged life. "She wears that same faded black dress every single day. It is practically gray now." The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting, and Martha felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. It was true that she had only one morning dress, and it had seen better days. Every penny she earned went toward food and rent, leaving nothing for luxuries like new clothing. She had even sold her wedding ring to pay for Thomas's burial, a decision that still haunted her in the quiet moments before sleep claimed her each night. She finally reached the back entrance of Miller's General Store and set down the buckets with a grateful sigh. Her shoulders ached from the effort, but there was no time to rest. Mr. Miller expected her to sweep the floors, organize the new shipment of canned goods, and help customers until closing time at 7. Then she would climb the narrow stairs to her small room, eat whatever scraps she had managed to save from breakfast, and fall into an exhausted sleep before starting the whole routine again the next morning. "Martha, you are late," Mr. Miller called out from behind the counter, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Mrs. Henderson has been waiting for assistance for 5 minutes now." "My apologies, sir," Martha said quickly, smoothing down her dress and hurrying to where Mrs. Henderson stood with her arms crossed and her lips pursed in irritation. "How may I help you today, madam?" Mrs. Henderson looked her up and down with obvious disdain before rattling off a list of items she needed. Martha gathered them efficiently, years of practice making her movements quick and precise. She could feel the older woman's eyes on her the entire time, assessing, judging, finding her lacking in ways both spoken and unspoken. "I suppose you will be looking for a new husband soon, Mrs. Henderson said, as Martha wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Though I cannot imagine who would be willing to take on a widow with no dowry and no prospects. You should have been more careful with your first chance, girl." The words hit like a physical blow, but Martha kept her expression neutral as she tied the package with string. "That will be $2.35, madam." Mrs. Henderson huffed and counted out the exact change with deliberate slowness, making Martha wait with her hand extended. Finally, she dropped the coins into Martha's palm and swept out of the store without another word, leaving Martha standing there with her hand still trembling slightly from the effort of maintaining her composure. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of similar encounters. Every customer seemed to have an opinion about her situation, and none of them were kind. By the time Mr. Miller locked the front door and dismissed her for the evening, Martha felt hollowed out, scraped raw by the constant barrage of cruelty disguised as concern or simple observation. She climbed the stairs to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the faded wallpaper and trying not to cry. She had shed so many tears already for Thomas, for their lost dreams, for the future they would never have together. Now she cried for herself, for the loneliness that pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, for the knowledge that this might be her life forever, existing on the margins of society, neither fully part of the community nor completely cast out from it. A knock on her door startled her out of her misery. She wiped her eyes quickly and opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who rented the room next to hers. Unlike most of the town's residents, Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to Martha, offering small gestures of friendship that meant more than the old woman probably realized. "I made too much stew tonight," Mrs. Patterson said, holding out a covered bowl that was still warm. "I thought you might help me finish it so it does not go to waste." Martha knew this was a polite fiction, that Mrs. Patterson had deliberately made extra food because she worried about Martha's thin frame and hollow cheeks, but she was too grateful to refuse. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That is very kind of you." Mrs. Patterson patted her hand gently. "You are a good girl, Martha Reynolds. Do not let this town's gossips convince you otherwise. Your worth is not determined by their small minds and smaller hearts." After Mrs. Patterson left, Martha ate the stew slowly, savoring every bite. It was the best meal she had eaten in weeks, and she felt some of her strength returning with each spoonful. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe she did have worth beyond what the people of Rawlins believed. But it was hard to hold onto that conviction when the whole world seemed determined to prove otherwise. The next morning dawned hot and bright, promising another scorching summer day. Martha rose early, washed her face in the basin, and braided her dark hair into a simple style that would keep it off her neck in the heat. Her dress was clean but worn, the black fabric faded to charcoal gray in places where the sun had bleached it during her daily walks to and from the well. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. When had she become so thin, so pale, so defeated? She shook off the melancholy and headed downstairs to begin her morning chores. Mr. Miller was already in the store, unpacking a new shipment of goods that had arrived on yesterday's stage coach. He barely acknowledged her presence as she grabbed the broom and began sweeping the floor, the rhythmic motion almost meditative in its simplicity. The bell above the door chimed around mid-morning, and Martha looked up to see a stranger enter the store. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his faded blue shirt, and his face was tanned from long hours in the sun. He wore typical cowboy attire, worn denim pants, scuffed leather boots, and a hat that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, warm hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything with a quiet intelligence and a hint of humor. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "I am looking for supplies. Just rode into town and I will be staying for a while." Mr. Miller bustled over immediately, his demeanor changing from gruff to ingratiating in an instant. "Welcome, welcome. We have everything you might need. I am Edgar Miller, owner of this establishment. Are you passing through or looking for work?" "Carter Lawrence," the stranger said, extending his hand for a shake. "I am the new foreman at the Double B Ranch just north of town. Mr. Brennan hired me to help expand his operation." Martha continued sweeping, but she could not help listening to their conversation. The Double B was one of the largest ranches in the area, and the foreman position was highly coveted. This Carter Lawrence must be quite skilled with cattle and horses to have earned such a role. "Excellent, excellent," Mr. Miller said, practically rubbing his hands together with glee at the prospect of a steady customer with money to spend. "What can I get for you today?" Carter rattled off a list of items, everything from coffee and flour to rope and nails. As Mr. Miller gathered the supplies, Carter's gaze wandered around the store and landed on Martha. She felt his eyes on her and looked up, expecting to see the same judgment and pity she saw in everyone else's faces. Instead, he offered her a small, friendly smile and tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement. The simple gesture of respect caught her so off guard that she forgot to look away, and for a moment, they just stared at each other across the dusty store. Then Mr. Miller called for her assistance, and the spell was broken. "Martha, come help me carry these supplies to the counter," Mr. Miller ordered. She set aside the broom and hurried to obey, gathering cans of beans and bags of flour. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Carter's presence just a few feet away, his tall frame somehow making the store feel smaller and more crowded than usual. "Martha," Carter said suddenly, trying out her name. "That is a good, solid name." She glanced up at him, startled that he was speaking directly to her. "Thank you, sir." "No need for formality," he said with another one of those easy smiles. "Just Carter will do fine. Are you Mr. Miller's daughter?" "No, sir, I mean Carter," she corrected herself quickly. "I work here." Before Carter could respond, the bell above the door chimed again and 3 women entered, Mrs. Hutchinson, Miss Garrett, and Mrs. Henderson, the same trio who had mocked her yesterday. They stopped short when they saw the stranger, their eyes lighting up with interest and curiosity. "Oh my, Mrs. Hutchinson said, her voice suddenly syrupy sweet. "We have a new face in town. How delightful." Carter turned toward them with polite interest, but not the eager attention they were clearly hoping for. "Good morning, ladies. Carter Lawrence just hired on at the Double B." The women practically fell over themselves introducing themselves and their unmarried daughters, granddaughters, and nieces. Martha watched the display with a mixture of amusement and resignation. This was how it always went. Any eligible man who came to town was immediately swarmed by the matchmaking matrons who saw every bachelor as a potential prize to be won. "You simply must come to dinner," Mrs. Hutchinson gushed. "My daughter, Emily, is an excellent cook and such fine company. She would be so pleased to meet you. And my niece is visiting from Cheyenne," Miss Garrett added quickly. "Such a refined young lady, educated at a proper finishing school." Carter held up his hands in a gesture of good-natured surrender. "That is very kind of you all, but I am going to be quite busy getting settled into my new position. Perhaps another time." Mrs. Henderson's gaze shifted to Martha, who was still standing near the counter with her arms full of supplies, and her expression turned calculating. "I see you have already met our local widow," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Poor dear, lost her husband at such a young age. Of course, she has to work now to support herself since there was no money left. Such a tragedy." The words were meant to diminish Martha, to mark her as damaged goods in front of this attractive newcomer. Martha felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her eyes down and continued stacking the supplies on the counter. "I see," Carter said slowly, and Martha braced herself for the inevitable change in his demeanor, the subtle withdrawal that would signal his understanding that she was not worth his attention or respect. But then he said something that made her head snap up in shock. "Well, that just proves she is strong and capable, does it not? Takes real courage to face hardship head-on instead of relying on others for support." The women looked taken aback, clearly not expecting that response. Mrs. Henderson recovered first, her smile tight and forced. "Oh, I suppose one could look at it that way. Though of course a woman's proper place is in the home, not working in a shop like some common laborer." "I have always believed that honest work is nothing to be ashamed of," Carter said mildly, but there was an edge of steel in his voice that suggested he would not be swayed from his opinion. "Seems to me that anyone willing to work hard deserves respect, regardless of their circumstances." The women exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to this unexpected defense of someone they considered beneath their notice. After a few more minutes of awkward small talk, they made their excuses and left, their departure marked by furious whispers that Martha could not quite make out. After they left, Carter turned back to Mr. Miller to settle his bill. As the storekeeper tallied up the costs, Carter glanced at Martha again. "Do not let them get to you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Small-minded people always need someone to look down on to make themselves feel important. Martha was so surprised by his kindness that she could not find words to respond. She just nodded, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone besides Mrs. Patterson had spoken to her with simple human decency that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Carter paid for his supplies and loaded them into a wagon waiting outside. Before he left, he looked back at Martha one more time and gave her that same friendly smile. "I expect I will be back soon for more supplies. It was nice meeting you, Martha." "You too," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. After he left, Mr. Miller shot her a warning look. "Do not get any ideas about that man," he said sharply. "He is far too good a prospect to be interested in a penniless widow. Best you remember your place." Martha did not respond, but his words stung nonetheless because they echoed her own thoughts. Of course, someone like Carter Lawrence would not be interested in her. He had been kind, but that was just common decency, not any sign of romantic interest. She would be a fool to think otherwise. But despite her best efforts to dismiss the encounter, she found herself thinking about Carter throughout the rest of the day. His easy smile, his warm eyes, the way he had defended her without being asked. It had been such a small thing, really, but it felt monumental to someone who had endured months of constant criticism and rejection. That evening, as she lay in her narrow bed watching shadows dance across the ceiling, Martha allowed herself a brief moment of fantasy. What would it be like to be courted by someone like Carter Lawrence? To have someone look at her with admiration instead of pity or contempt? To feel valued and cherished instead of tolerated? But she pushed the thoughts away almost as soon as they formed. That kind of happiness was not meant for her, not anymore. She had her chance at love and lost it, and the world had made it clear that she should not expect another. Better to focus on survival, on getting through each day, than to waste time on impossible dreams. The next few weeks passed in their usual routine, with one notable difference. Carter came into the store regularly, always needing some supply or another for the ranch. And each time he came, he made a point of speaking to Martha, asking how she was doing, commenting on the weather, or sharing some amusing anecdote from his work. It was nothing romantic or inappropriate, just friendly conversation, but it meant the world to Martha. The women of Rawlins noticed, of course. They always noticed everything. The whispers grew louder and more vicious, speculation about what the widow might be doing to attract the attention of such an eligible bachelor. Some suggested she was being too forward, others that she was using feminine wiles to trap him into marriage. The accusations were absurd, given that Martha barely said more than a few words to Carter during his visits. But truth had never been a requirement for gossip. One particularly hot afternoon in August, Martha was outside sweeping the wooden walkway in front of the store when a group of young men rode by on their horses. They had clearly been drinking, even though it was barely past noon, and they called out crude comments as they passed. "Hey there, widow woman," one of them shouted. "You looking for a new husband? I will take you for a ride if you are lonely." The others laughed raucously, and Martha kept her head down, trying to ignore them, but they circled back, clearly not done amusing themselves at her expense. "What is the matter? Too good for us now?" Another one taunted. "I heard you have been making eyes at that fancy new foreman. You think he is actually interested in used goods?" Martha's hands tightened on the broom handle, but she said nothing. Experience had taught her that responding only encouraged them. "Leave her alone," a familiar voice said firmly, and Martha looked up to see Carter walking down the street toward them. He must have been heading to the store for supplies. The young men turned their horses to face him, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to sullen defiance. "This is none of your business, Lawrence," the first one said. "We are just having a bit of fun." "Your fun is cruel and unwelcome," Carter said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. "I suggest you ride on and sober up before you do something you will regret." "And if we do not?" one of the others challenged, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. Carter's expression did not change, but something in his stance made it clear he was not intimidated. "Then you will find out just how serious I am about treating people with respect. Your choice, boys." For a long moment, tension hung thick in the air. Martha held her breath, afraid that violence might erupt right there on Main Street. But finally, the young men seemed to think better of their bravado. With muttered curses and dark looks, they wheeled their horses around and rode off toward the saloon at the far end of town. Carter watched them go before turning to Martha. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with genuine concern. Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline coursing through her body now that the confrontation was over. "Come on," Carter said gently. "Let us get you inside and get you some water." He guided her into the store with a hand on her elbow, his touch respectful but steadying. Mr. Miller looked up from his ledger with a frown, but he did not comment as Carter led Martha to a chair near the counter and fetched her a cup of water from the bucket she had brought from the well that morning. Martha drank gratefully, the cool liquid helping to settle her nerves. "Thank you," she said finally. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Carter said simply. "No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not someone who has done nothing wrong." Mr. Miller cleared his throat loudly. "I have those supplies ready for you, Mr. Lawrence." "The ones you ordered last week." Carter straightened, seeming to remember why he had come to the store in the first place. "Right, thank you." But before he moved away, he looked down at Martha again. "Will you be all right?" She nodded, managing a small smile. "I will be fine. Thank you again." After Carter left with his supplies, Mr. Miller turned to Martha with an expression of intense irritation. "This needs to stop," he said flatly. "You are causing problems by attracting too much attention. First those rowdy boys, and now you have the new foreman acting as your protector." "People are talking." "I have not done anything," Martha protested weakly. "I have never encouraged any attention." "It does not matter what you have or have not done," Mr. Miller snapped. The perception is what matters. And right now people are perceiving you as a woman who is trying to use her widow status to gain sympathy and manipulate decent men. If this continues, I may have to reconsider your employment here." The threat hung in the air like a noose. Martha felt panic rising in her chest because without this job she had nothing. No money, no shelter, no way to survive. "Please," she said desperately, "I need this position. I will do whatever you ask. I will work longer hours, take lower wages, anything." Mr. Miller considered her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "See that you keep a more appropriate distance from customers, especially male ones. I cannot have my store becoming the subject of scandal." Martha agreed, though the unfairness of it burned in her chest. She had done nothing to encourage attention, nothing to warrant the gossip and speculation. But that did not matter in a world where a woman's reputation was everything and could be destroyed by forces completely beyond her control. That evening, as she sat in her room eating a meager dinner of bread and cheese, Martha heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing there with her usual kind expression. "I heard about what happened today," the older woman said. "Are you all right, dear?" Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the simple question. "I do not know," she admitted. "I feel like I am drowning, and no matter how hard I try to stay afloat, the waves just keep coming." Mrs. Patterson pulled her into a gentle hug, and Martha finally let herself cry, all the fear and frustration and loneliness pouring out in great, heaving sobs. The older woman just held her and made soothing sounds until the storm passed. "Listen to me, Mrs. Patterson said when Martha had calmed down enough to listen. "You are stronger than you know, and you deserve happiness just as much as anyone else in this town. Do not let them convince you otherwise." "But what if Mr. Miller fires me?" Martha asked, her voice small and afraid. "What will I do then?" "We will figure something out," Mrs. Patterson assured her. "You are not alone, no matter how much it feels that way sometimes." The words were a comfort, but Martha knew that Mrs. Patterson's kindness could only protect her so much. In the end, she had to find her own way to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. The next time Carter came into the store, nearly a week later, Martha made a conscious effort to keep her distance as Mr. Miller had demanded. She stayed busy with tasks at the far end of the store, avoiding eye contact and limiting their interaction to the bare minimum required for professional courtesy. Carter seemed puzzled by the change in her behavior, but did not push. He completed his purchases and left without the usual friendly conversation, and Martha felt a pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. She had not realized how much those brief interactions had meant to her until they were gone. But keeping her distance proved impossible because Carter kept finding reasons to come to the store. And each time, he tried to engage her in conversation, refusing to accept her new cold politeness. Finally, on a cooler September morning when the first hints of autumn were beginning to touch the air, Carter came in and walked straight to where Martha was organizing shelves. "Have I done something to offend you?" he asked directly, his voice low enough that Mr. Miller could not hear from his position at the front counter. Martha kept her eyes on the cans she was stacking. "No, of course not." "Then why have you been avoiding me for the past few weeks?" She wanted to explain, to tell him about Mr. Miller's threat and the impossible position she was in. But how could she do that without sounding like she was seeking his sympathy or, worse, trying to manipulate him into defending her again? "I think it is better this way," she said quietly. "People talk, and I cannot afford for my reputation to be damaged any further." Carter was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that shocked her. "What if I do not care what people say?" Martha finally looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or cruelty. But all she saw was sincerity and something else, something that made her heart beat faster in her chest. "You should care," she said, trying to be practical even as hope fluttered treacherously in her chest. "You have a good position, a future here. Being associated with me will only bring you problems." "Maybe I think you are worth a few problems," Carter said, and the simple statement hit her like a thunderbolt. Before she could respond, Mr. Miller called out, "Martha, I need you up front. We have customers." She hurried away, her mind reeling from Carter's words. What did he mean? Was he simply being kind, or was he suggesting something more? And even if it was more, what could possibly come of it? She was a penniless widow with nothing to offer a man like him. But over the next few weeks, Carter made his intentions increasingly clear. He started timing his visits to the store to coincide with her afternoon break, when she would step outside for a few minutes of fresh air. He would happen to be walking by and would stop to chat, their conversations growing longer and more personal with each encounter. He told her about his life growing up on a small farm in Kansas, how he had learned about cattle and horses from his father, and how he had eventually left home to seek his fortune further west. She told him about her brief marriage to Thomas, carefully editing out the most painful parts, and about her dreams of someday having a real home again, instead of just a rented room. "You deserve that and so much more," Carter said one afternoon as they stood in the alley beside the store, hidden from prying eyes by the building's bulk. "You deserve to be happy, Martha." "I am not sure happiness is meant for everyone," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she felt something shifting inside her. Being around Carter made her feel alive again in a way she had not experienced since Thomas died. He made her remember that she was more than just an object of pity or scorn, that she was a person with hopes and dreams and value. "I think you are wrong about that," Carter said, and then he did something incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on one's perspective. He reached out and gently took her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending warmth racing up her arm and straight to her heart. Martha knew she should pull away, knew that anyone could see them and that it would only fuel the gossip fire, but she could not make herself let go. His hand was warm and calloused from hard work, strong and steady, and holding it made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a very long time. "Carter," she breathed, his name a question and a plea all at once. "I know what people say about you," he said, his hazel eyes locked on hers with unwavering intensity. "I know they think you are somehow less because you were married before and lost your husband, but they are wrong, Martha. Dead wrong. You are not used up or damaged or any of the other cruel things they say. You are strong and brave and beautiful, and any man would be lucky to have you in his life." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "How can you say that? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said firmly. "I know that you work hard without complaint, that you keep your dignity even when people treat you terribly, and that you have a kind heart despite all the cruelty you have endured. That is more than enough for me." "But I have nothing to offer you," Martha said desperately, needing him to understand the reality of her situation. "No dowry, no family connections, no prospects, just debts and a tarnished reputation." Carter smiled, that warm, wonderful smile that made her heart do strange things in her chest. "You have yourself to offer, and that is everything I want." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so sweet and romantic that Martha felt like she might faint from the sheer intensity of the emotion flooding through her. "I am courting you, Martha Reynolds," Carter declared. "Officially and publicly, so there is no confusion about my intentions. I am going to court you properly, and if you will have me, I am going to marry you and give you that home you have been dreaming about." Martha could hardly believe what she was hearing. It seemed too good to be true, like a fairy tale that would surely shatter the moment she tried to hold on to it. What if people try to stop us? What if they make trouble for you at the ranch? Let them try, Carter said with absolute confidence. Mr. Brennan hired me because I am good at my job, and I will continue to be good at it regardless of who I choose to court. And as for the rest of this town, well, they can mind their own business or not. It makes no difference to me. Over the next few days, Rawlins erupted with gossip about Carter Lawrence's shocking decision to court the widow Reynolds. The reaction was exactly as Martha had feared. Some people were merely scandalized, clutching their pearls and whispering behind their hands about the impropriety of it all. Others were openly hostile, making their disapproval known in cutting remarks and cold shoulders. Mrs. Hutchinson accosted Martha outside the store one afternoon, her face red with indignation. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she hissed. "Using your wiles to trap that poor man when there are so many more suitable young ladies available. Have you no decency?" Martha had learned from Carter's example and stood a little straighter, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Lawrence makes his own decisions," she said calmly. "I have neither trapped him nor used any wiles. He chose to court me of his own free will." "We shall see how long that lasts," Mrs. Hutchinson snapped before storming away, but Carter proved as good as his word. He courted Martha openly and enthusiastically, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned by the social consequences. He took her on walks through town, escorted her to church on Sundays, and even brought her flowers from the meadow near the ranch, simple wildflowers that meant more to her than the fanciest roses ever could. Mr. Miller was furious about the situation, but could not actually fire Martha without a legitimate reason, and she was careful to continue performing her duties impeccably. He settled for making snide comments and giving her the worst tasks, but Martha endured it all with patience because she had something precious to sustain her now. Hope. Carter introduced her to his world slowly and carefully. One Sunday, he brought her out to the Double B Ranch to meet his employer and see where he worked. The ranch was sprawling and impressive, with a large main house, several barns, and extensive corrals filled with cattle and horses. Mr. Brennan, the ranch owner, was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Martha was nervous about meeting him, worried that he would disapprove of her relationship with his foreman, but he surprised her by shaking her hand firmly and saying, "Carter tells me you are a hard worker. That is good enough for me. Any woman who earns her own keep has my respect." The simple acceptance nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had grown so accustomed to judgment and rejection that straightforward kindness felt almost foreign. Carter showed her around the ranch, his pride in his work evident in the way he talked about the cattle breeding program he was implementing and the improvements he had planned for the property. Martha found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, asking questions and genuinely interested in the answers. "Could you be happy here?" Carter asked as they stood at a fence watching the sun set over the rolling hills. "Living on a ranch, I mean. It is hard work and sometimes lonely." Martha looked at the land stretching out before them, wild and beautiful and full of possibility. Then she looked at Carter, at his honest face and hopeful eyes, and knew her answer. "I could be happy anywhere with you." Carter's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms right there in the open, not caring who might see. "Then marry me, Martha. Be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are perfect just as you are." "Perfect," Martha laughed through her tears. "I am far from perfect, Carter Lawrence." "You are perfect to me," he insisted, holding her face between his hands so she had to look into his eyes. "Every part of you, every experience you have had, everything that makes you who you are. You are exactly what I want, exactly what I need. Please say yes." Martha had never been one for dramatic gestures or impulsive decisions. Her marriage to Thomas had been sensible and practical, based on mutual affection and compatible goals. But standing there in Carter's arms with the Wyoming sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she felt something she had never experienced before, absolute certainty that this was right, that this man was her future, that saying yes would be the best decision of her life. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes, I will marry you." Carter let out a whoop of joy that startled the nearby cattle and lifted her right off her feet, spinning her around in a circle while she laughed with pure, unrestrained happiness. When he finally set her down, he kissed her for the first time, a sweet, tender kiss that held the promise of all the kisses to come. They told Mr. Brennan about their engagement before leaving the ranch that evening, and he immediately offered them the use of the foreman's house, a small but sturdy structure that Carter had been living in alone since taking the job. "A married man needs a proper home," he declared. "And I expect you will need a woman's touch to make it comfortable." Martha was overwhelmed by his generosity. The thought of having an actual house, a real home to call her own, was almost too wonderful to believe. She thanked him profusely, already imagining curtains in the windows and a garden in the yard. News of their engagement spread through Rawlins like wildfire, and the reactions were predictably mixed. Carter's friends at the ranch were happy for him, slapping him on the back and offering congratulations. The local minister agreed to perform the ceremony without any hesitation, having always thought Martha had been treated unfairly by the congregation. But the gossiping women of the town were outraged, viewing Martha's triumph as a personal affront. "She has no right to such happiness," Miss Garrett complained loudly in the street where Martha could hear her. "She is a widow. She has already had her chance at marriage. She should step aside and let more deserving girls have a turn." Martha tried not to let the comments bother her, but they still stung. Carter, however, had no such restraint. When he heard Miss Garrett's remarks, he walked right up to her on Main Street and said in a voice loud enough for half the town to hear, "Martha is more deserving of happiness than anyone I have ever met. She has faced loss and hardship with grace and courage, and she has every right to a second chance at love. If you cannot be happy for her, then I suggest you examine your own heart and ask yourself why someone else's joy threatens you so much." Miss Garrett sputtered and turned red, but she had no response to that logic. She hurried away with her skirts swishing indignantly, and Carter just shook his head before continuing on his way. Martha, who had witnessed the exchange from inside the store, felt a surge of love so intense it nearly knocked her over. This man, this wonderful, brave, kind man had chosen her, had looked at all her flaws and scars and burdens and said she was perfect. How had she gotten so lucky? They decided on a simple ceremony to be held in late October, giving Martha time to save a little money for a new dress and Carter time to make some improvements to the house. Martha gave her notice to Mr. Miller, who accepted it with barely concealed relief. She would work until her wedding day and then begin her new life as Mrs. Carter Lawrence. The weeks leading up to the wedding were some of the happiest of Martha's life, but they were not without challenges. The continued hostility from certain members of the community wore on her nerves, and there were moments when she wondered if she was being selfish by accepting Carter's proposal. He deserved someone who could bring him social connections and financial advantages, not a woman whose presence in his life would only create problems. She voiced these concerns to Carter one evening as they sat on the porch of the foreman's house, their house now, planning the future together. He listened patiently to her worries, and then he took both her hands in his. "Martha, look at me," he said gently but firmly. "I am going to say this one more time, and I need you to really hear it and believe it. I do not want social connections or financial advantages. I do not want some pampered society girl who has never worked a day in her life. I want you. I want your strength and your kindness and your courage. I want to wake up every morning next to someone who understands what it means to face adversity and come out the other side. I want to build a life with someone who knows the value of what we are creating together, because she has lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. That is you, Martha. You are what I want." His words finally penetrated the layers of doubt and insecurity that had built up over the months of abuse and rejection. Martha felt something inside her shift and settle, a fundamental acceptance of the truth he was offering her. She was worthy of love. She was worthy of happiness. And she was going to grab onto both with both hands and never let go. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. "I love you so much, Carter Lawrence." His face transformed with joy. "I love you too, Martha Reynolds, soon to be Martha Lawrence." They kissed as the stars came out overhead, and Martha felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in the arms of a man who saw her true value and cherished her for it. The wedding day arrived with crisp autumn weather, the sky a brilliant blue and the air sharp with the promise of coming winter. Martha wore a simple but lovely dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, a soft blue cotton that brought out the color in her eyes. She had no family to attend, her parents having died when she was young and Thomas's family having cut her off after his death. But Mrs. Patterson stood with her as a witness and friend. Carter waited at the front of the small church, looking impossibly handsome in his best clothes with his hair neatly trimmed and his face glowing with happiness. When Martha walked down the aisle on Mrs. Patterson's arm, his eyes never left her face, and the love she saw there made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. The minister spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of choosing a partner who would stand by you through all of life's trials. Carter and Martha exchanged vows, their voices strong and clear, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Carter kissed her with such enthusiasm that several people in the small congregation laughed. Martha did not care. She was married to the man she loved, and nothing else mattered. The reception was held at the ranch, with Mr. Brennan generously providing food and drink for the celebration. Not everyone from town attended, of course, but those who did come were the people who truly mattered, friends who were happy for them rather than judgmental gossips looking for reasons to criticize. As the sun set and the party continued, Carter pulled Martha aside and led her to their house, their home. He had been working on it for weeks, making repairs and improvements, and now he wanted to show her the final result. Martha gasped when she stepped inside. The main room was clean and bright, with new curtains on the windows and a cheerful rug on the floor. The furniture was simple but sturdy, and there was a bouquet of wildflowers on the table, just like the ones Carter had brought her during their courtship. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawrence," Carter said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "Home," Martha repeated, savoring the word. She had a home again, a real home with a husband who loved her and a future that stretched out before them full of possibility. That night, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and passion, exploring each other slowly and learning what brought pleasure. Martha had been intimate with Thomas, but this felt different, deeper somehow. With Carter, she felt completely safe and cherished, free to be vulnerable in a way she had never been before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bed, talking quietly about their plans for the future. Carter wanted to eventually buy his own ranch, and Martha wanted to help him achieve that dream. They talked about having children, maybe 3 or 4 if they were blessed, and about growing old together on their land. "You think you will ever regret choosing me?" Martha asked in a moment of vulnerability. Carter tightened his arms around her. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Martha Lawrence." And lying there in the darkness with her husband's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Martha finally believed him. She let go of all the pain and shame the people of Rawlins had tried to make her carry. She was not a shameful widow to be pitied or mocked. She was a woman who had survived loss and found love again. She was Carter's wife, and she was going to build a beautiful life with him. The first months of their marriage were blissful. Martha threw herself into making their house a true home, sewing curtains and tablecloths, planting a small garden that would produce vegetables come spring, and learning to cook Carter's favorite meals. He came home each evening tired from long days working with the cattle and horses, but he always had energy to talk with her about his day and listen to her stories about her own activities. The people of Rawlins gradually adjusted to the reality of their marriage. Some remained hostile, refusing to acknowledge Martha when they passed on the street, but others slowly began to thaw. Mrs. Patterson visited often, delighted to see her friend so happy. And to Martha's surprise, a few of the other women in town, particularly those who worked for their living rather than relying on their husband's wealth, began to treat her with tentative friendliness. One of these women was Sarah Cooper, a young schoolteacher who had always been kind to Martha but had kept her distance to avoid social complications. After the wedding, Sarah made a point of inviting Martha to join a quilting circle she was organizing, a small but significant gesture of acceptance. Martha was nervous about attending the first meeting, worried that she would be met with hostility from the other women present. But Sarah had carefully chosen the participants, and everyone there was friendly and welcoming. They spent a pleasant afternoon piecing together quilt squares and chatting about everyday things, and Martha felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced since before Thomas's death. Winter came to Wyoming with its usual ferocity, bringing bitter cold and heavy snows that blanketed the land in white. Carter worked long hours ensuring the cattle were fed and safe, often coming home so exhausted he could barely eat dinner before falling into bed. Martha worried about him during those harsh months, but he always assured her that this was just part of ranch life, and that spring would bring easier days. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated quietly together in their warm house while snow fell outside the windows. Carter had saved up to buy Martha a beautiful shawl, soft wool in a deep green color that she loved. She had knitted him a sweater, working on it secretly in the evenings after he fell asleep. They exchanged gifts by firelight and held each other close, grateful for the warmth and love they shared. "This is my best Christmas ever," Martha said as they sat together on the floor in front of the fireplace, her back resting against his chest. "Mine too," Carter agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day with you is a gift, but today especially." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Martha began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She was simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the possibility. She had always wanted children, but pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, and she had heard too many stories of women who did not survive the experience. She waited until she was certain before telling Carter, wanting to be sure before getting his hopes up. When she finally shared the news one evening in early March, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a shout of pure joy and picked her up carefully, spinning her around before setting her down gently as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, his face glowing with wonder. "We are going to be parents." Martha laughed at his enthusiasm, her own fears temporarily forgotten in the face of his happiness. "Yes, we are. Sometime in late September or early October, I think." Carter immediately became overprotective, insisting that she should not lift heavy things or work too hard. Martha tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love and concern. As her belly began to swell with their growing child, she felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. She was going to be a mother, something she had dreamed of but feared might never happen after Thomas died. The pregnancy was not easy. She suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon and exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. But Carter was endlessly patient and supportive, taking on extra household chores and never complaining about the burden. His devotion during those difficult months only deepened Martha's love for him. Summer arrived hot and dry, and Martha spent much of her time in the shade of the porch, sewing tiny clothes for the baby and dreaming about what their child would be like. Would they have a son or a daughter? Would the baby have Carter's hazel eyes or her own dark ones? The women from the quilting circle rallied around her, bringing gifts and advice and sharing their own stories of pregnancy and childbirth. Even some of the women who had been unkind to her before softened slightly. The prospect of a new baby bringing out a maternal instinct that transcended social divisions. Mrs. Hutchinson, who had been one of Martha's harshest critics, actually stopped by the house one afternoon with a tiny knitted blanket. "For the baby," she said stiffly, not quite meeting Martha's eyes. "Every child deserves a warm blanket." Martha accepted the gift graciously, understanding that this was as close to an apology as the proud woman could manage. "Thank you, Mrs. Hutchinson. This is very kind of you." As September approached, Martha grew increasingly nervous about the impending birth. She had arranged for the town midwife, Mrs. O'Brien, to attend her, and Sarah Cooper had volunteered to help as well. Carter wanted to be present, which was unusual but not unheard of, and Martha was grateful for his insistence. She could not imagine going through something so momentous without him by her side. Labor began on a cool evening in late September, starting with mild contractions that gradually intensified over the course of several hours. Carter sent for Mrs. O'Brien and Sarah while staying close to Martha, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement as the pain grew stronger. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Martha had never experienced anything so painful or exhausting, but Carter never left her side, his presence a constant source of strength. When she felt like she could not go on, when the pain became so intense she thought she might die from it, he was there whispering that she was strong, that she could do this, that he loved her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Martha heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. O'Brien worked efficiently, cleaning the infant and checking to make sure everything was as it should be. "You have a son," the midwife announced with a smile, placing the tiny bundle in Martha's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Martha looked down at her son through tears of joy and exhaustion. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, she saw that they were a deep blue that might eventually turn to hazel like his father's. Carter leaned over them both, his own eyes wet with tears. "He is beautiful," he whispered in awe. "You did so well, Martha. I am so proud of you." They named him Thomas Carter Lawrence, honoring both Martha's first husband and his father. Martha had worried that Carter might object to giving their son her late husband's name, but he had insisted. "Thomas was part of your life, part of who you are," he had said when they discussed it. "Our son should carry that legacy." The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting in an entirely different way than pregnancy had been. Thomas cried frequently, needing to be fed and changed and comforted at all hours. Martha was overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping this tiny human alive, but Carter helped as much as he could, getting up in the middle of the night to walk with his son when the baby was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, and taking over household chores so Martha could rest when the baby slept. The people of Rawlins rallied around them in a way Martha had never experienced before. Women brought meals and offers of help. Men congratulated Carter and offered advice based on their own experiences as fathers. Even those who had been most critical of their marriage seemed to soften in the face of new life. As autumn progressed and winter approached again, Martha marveled at how much her life had changed in just a little over a year. She had gone from being a lonely, mocked widow to a beloved wife and mother with a home and a future. The pain of losing Thomas would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had mourned and healed and found love again, proving that the human heart was capable of infinite resilience. Young Thomas grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled easily and laughed at his father's silly faces. Carter was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, teaching him about the world in ways the infant could not possibly understand yet, but that laid the foundation for the bond they would share. On their first wedding anniversary, Carter surprised Martha by presenting her with a deed. She unfolded the paper with trembling hands and read it carefully, her eyes widening as she understood what she was looking at. "You bought land?" she asked in disbelief. Carter nodded, barely able to contain his excitement. 200 acres just east of here. Mr. Brennan helped me secure a good price, and I have been saving every penny I could. It is ours, Martha, our land to build our ranch on." Martha threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. This was the dream they had talked about on their wedding night, the future they had planned together. And now it was real, tangible proof that their life together was everything they had hoped it would be. "When can we start building?" she asked eagerly. "Next spring," Carter said. "I will keep working for Mr. Brennan through the winter and save more money for materials. By this time next year, we should be living in our own house on our own land." True to his word, Carter spent the winter planning and saving. He drew up blueprints for their future home, a modest but comfortable structure with room for their growing family. Martha contributed ideas, suggesting a large kitchen where she could cook and bake, and a spacious porch where they could sit on summer evenings. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and turning the world green again, Carter began building their house with help from friends he had made at the Double B Ranch. Mr. Brennan even gave him several days off to work on the project, understanding that a man needed to establish his own legacy. Martha watched the house take shape over the weeks, walls rising from the foundation, a roof going on, windows being installed. She walked the land with Thomas in her arms, showing him the place where he would grow up, though he was too young to understand. She planted the beginning of an orchard, young fruit trees that would take years to mature, but would eventually provide apples and peaches for her family. By summer, the house was complete enough to move into. It was not entirely finished. There were still improvements to be made and touches to be added, but it had walls and a roof and was theirs. They spent their first night in their own home lying on a blanket on the floor of the main room because their furniture had not been moved yet, but Martha had never been happier. "We did it," she whispered as they lay together under the stars visible through the window. "We built our dream." "We did," Carter agreed, pulling her close. "And this is just the beginning. We are going to build something incredible here, Martha. I can feel it." Over the next several years, they did exactly that. Carter built up a small but successful cattle operation, gaining a reputation for quality livestock and fair dealing. Martha managed the household and helped with the ranch work when she could, her strength and resilience proving valuable time and again. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Caroline Elizabeth in 1881, and another son they called Matthew James in 1883. Their family grew and flourished on the land they had claimed together. The fruit trees Martha had planted began to bear fruit, and she sold preserves and pies to people in Rawlins, earning extra money that went toward improving their home and expanding their herd. The children grew healthy and strong, raised with love and the knowledge that they were precious beyond measure. The people of Rawlins eventually came to fully accept the Lawrence family. Martha's hard work and Carter's success made it impossible to maintain the old prejudices and gossip. She was no longer the widow Reynolds, but Mrs. Lawrence, the rancher's wife, a woman respected in her own right for her contributions to the community. One afternoon, in the summer of 1885, Martha stood on the porch of their home watching her children play in the yard. Thomas, now almost 6 years old, was teaching his younger sister how to throw a ball. Matthew toddled around on chubby legs, chasing butterflies. Carter was out checking the cattle but would be home soon for dinner. Mrs. Patterson, who had moved to a small house on their property in her old age, sat beside Martha in a rocking chair, knitting peacefully. "You have built a good life here," the older woman observed. "I am so proud of you, dear girl." Martha smiled, thinking back to that terrible time when she had felt so alone and hopeless. "I could not have done it without you," she said honestly. "You were the only one who believed I deserved happiness when everyone else had written me off. I just saw what was already there," Mrs. Patterson said. "The strength and courage that got you through the hard times and brought you to this place." As if summoned by her thoughts, Carter appeared on horseback, riding up the path to their home. He dismounted and swept Caroline up in his arms, making her squeal with laughter. Then he set her down and came to the porch, leaning down to kiss Martha before settling into the chair beside her. "Good day?" Martha asked. "Very good," Carter confirmed. "The new calves are all healthy and I think we will have an excellent year. How about you?" "Also good," Martha said, reaching over to take his hand. "Every day with you and our children is good." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children play as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Martha thought about the young widow she had been, broken and mocked and convinced she would never know happiness again. That woman felt like a distant memory now, a person she had been in another lifetime. Carter had been right all those years ago when he told her she was perfect. Not because she was without flaws or had never made mistakes, but because she was exactly who she was supposed to be, scars and all. He had seen her value when no one else could, and in doing so, he had given her the most precious gift imaginable, the chance to see her own worth. As darkness fell and the stars came out, they gathered their children and went inside their home, the home they had built together through love and hard work and unwavering faith in each other. Martha tucked each child into bed with kisses and whispered blessings, then joined Carter in their own room. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked as they prepared for bed. "If you had listened to all those people who told you I was not worth your time." Carter pulled her into his arms, his expression serious. "I thank God every day that I trusted my own judgment instead of their gossip. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Martha Lawrence. You and our children are everything I could ever want or need." "You saved me," Martha said softly. "When I had given up hope, you showed me that I still had value, that my life was not over just because I had suffered loss. I will never be able to thank you enough for that." "You do not need to thank me," Carter said, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "Loving you has been the easiest and best thing I have ever done. You are my partner, my equal, my heart. We saved each other, I think. You made me understand what real love looks like, the kind that endures through hardship and grows stronger with time." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion that had only deepened over their years together. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief of losing Thomas, the cruelty of the people who mocked her widowhood, the fear that she would spend the rest of her life alone and scorned, all of it had led her to Carter and to this beautiful life they had created together. As the years continued to pass, the Lawrence Ranch prospered and grew. They eventually bought more land, expanding their operation until they were one of the most successful ranches in the area. Their children grew up strong and capable, learning the value of hard work and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. Thomas became a skilled horseman who could gentle even the wildest Mustang. Caroline developed a talent for numbers and kept the ranch's financial records with meticulous precision. Matthew, the baby of the family, showed an early aptitude for understanding cattle and was clearly destined to be a rancher like his father. In 1888, they had one more child, a daughter they named Grace Ann, a surprise blessing that completed their family. Martha was 30 years old by then and felt incredibly fortunate to have 4 healthy children and a husband who still looked at her with the same love and admiration he had shown when they first met. The town of Rawlins continued to grow and change around them. The railroad brought more people and opportunities, and Wyoming moved toward statehood. Through it all, the Lawrences remained a constant, respected members of a community that had once rejected Martha so cruelly. Some of the women who had been most unkind to her eventually apologized, though it took years for them to work up the courage. Martha accepted their apologies graciously, understanding that people could change and grow just as she had. She bore no grudges, having learned that holding on to anger only poisoned your own happiness. Mrs. Patterson lived until 1890, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. Her death hit Martha hard because the old woman had been her first friend in those dark days and had never wavered in her support. They buried her in the small cemetery on the ranch property, beneath a cottonwood tree where she could rest in the shade and look out over the land she had loved. As Martha stood at the grave after the funeral, Carter came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "She was very proud of you," he said quietly. "She told me once that watching you rebuild your life gave her hope that goodness still existed in the world." "I would not have survived without her kindness," Martha said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "She saw me as a person when everyone else only saw a shameful widow. That made all the difference." In the years that followed, Martha made it her mission to help other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. When a young widow named Ellen arrived in Rawlins in 1892, alone and frightened after her husband died in a mining accident, Martha immediately took her under her wing. She helped Ellen find work and a place to live, and when people began gossiping about the new widow, Martha shut them down with a few well-chosen words about compassion and Christian charity. Ellen eventually married a local shopkeeper and lived happily ever after, but she never forgot Martha's kindness. It became a pattern, Martha looking out for women who were struggling, offering help and support without judgment. She could not save everyone, but she could make a difference for some. And that was enough. Carter supported her efforts completely, proud of the woman his wife had become. She was no longer the frightened, broken widow he had first met, though traces of that woman still existed in her compassion for others suffering. She had transformed herself through sheer determination, and his love into someone strong and confident, a pillar of the community and a devoted mother and wife. Their children grew and eventually began lives of their own. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property in 1896, continuing the family tradition of working with cattle and horses. Caroline surprised everyone by going to college in Cheyenne, where she studied to become a teacher. Matthew stayed on the ranch, working alongside his father and learning everything Carter could teach him about running a successful operation. Grace, the youngest, was still in school but showed signs of inheriting her mother's compassionate nature and her father's strong work ethic. By the turn of the century, Martha and Carter had been married for nearly 20 years. They were in their early 40s, no longer the young couple who had defied social convention to be together, but a mature partnership that had weathered every storm life threw at them and emerged stronger for it. One evening in the fall of 1900, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The children were all occupied with their own activities, and for once, they had a moment of quiet together. "You remember when we first met?" Martha asked, her hand in Carter's as it had been countless times over the years. "Of course," Carter said with a smile. "You were sweeping the floor of Miller's General Store, trying to be invisible while those awful women mocked you. I knew right then that there was something special about you, the way you held your head high despite their cruelty." "I thought you were just being kind," Martha admitted. "I never imagined that you would actually want to court me, let alone marry me. You could have had anyone." "But I wanted you," Carter said simply. "I have never regretted that choice, not for a single moment. You have given me everything I ever wanted: a home, a family, a partner who stands beside me through everything. You are perfect to me, Martha. You always have been." The words still had the power to move her, even after all these years. Martha leaned her head on Carter's shoulder, feeling the same sense of safety and belonging she had felt on their wedding night. "And you are perfect to me," she said softly. "You saw my worth when no one else could, and you loved me when I felt unlovable. You gave me back my life, Carter. You gave me everything." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Their love had not been easy or without challenges, but it had endured, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. As Martha looked out at the land they had claimed together, at the home they had built and the family they had raised, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been mocked for being a widow at 20, scorned and rejected by a community that saw her as damaged and worthless. But Carter had looked past all that and seen the real her, strong and courageous and worthy of love. He had been right when he said she was perfect. Not because she was flawless, but because she was exactly who she was meant to be. And together, they had created a life more wonderful than anything she had dared to dream during those dark days after Thomas's death. The night grew cooler and Carter stood, offering his hand to help Martha to her feet. "Come on, Mrs. Lawrence," he said with that smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Let's go inside where it is warm." Martha took his hand and let him pull her up, and together they walked into their home, into the life they had built together through love and faith and unwavering commitment to each other. Behind them, the Wyoming night settled over the land, peaceful and perfect, just like the love story of Martha and Carter Lawrence, a widow who had been deemed worthless by society, and the cowboy who had seen her true value and claimed her as his own. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though Carter had certainly rescued her in his own way. It was a story of quiet courage, of choosing love over fear, of refusing to let other people's judgments determine your worth. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of building something beautiful from the ashes of loss. And it was a story that would continue for many more years, through the births of grandchildren and the expansion of their ranch, through quiet evenings on the porch and busy days, working side by side, through all the ordinary moments that make up an extraordinary life. Because that was what love really was, not the dramatic declarations or perfect moments, but the choice to stand beside someone day after day, year after year, seeing them for who they truly are and choosing them anyway. Martha and Carter had made that choice, and it had transformed both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. She had been a widow at 20, mocked and scorned and convinced her life was over. He had been a cowboy looking for something real in a world full of superficiality and pretense. Together, they had found what they were looking for and built a legacy that would last long after they were gone. As they prepared for bed that night, moving through the familiar routine they had performed thousands of times over the years, Martha caught sight of their reflection in the mirror. They had aged, of course, their faces showing the marks of hard work and sun exposure, but there was still so much love visible in the way they looked at each other, the way they moved together in perfect synchronization born of 2 decades of partnership. "What are you thinking about?" Carter asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Just how lucky I am," Martha said honestly. "How lucky we both are to have found each other." Carter came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "It was not luck," he said firmly. "It was fate, destiny, whatever you want to call it. We were meant to find each other, Martha. We were meant to build this life together." And as they climbed into bed and Carter pulled her close, Martha believed him. Their love had been tested by society's judgment, by financial hardship, by the normal stresses of building a life and raising a family. But it had survived everything, growing stronger and deeper with each challenge overcome. She fell asleep in her husband's arms, just as she had done thousands of times before, safe and warm and loved beyond measure. And if she dreamed that night, it was of sunsets over Wyoming hills, of children's laughter echoing through a home filled with warmth, and of hazel eyes that had looked at a broken widow and seen someone perfect. The story of Martha and Carter Lawrence became something of a legend in Rawlins, told to young couples as an example of what real love looked like, shared with young widows as proof that life could begin again after loss. It was a reminder that your worth was not determined by other people's opinions, that second chances did exist, and that sometimes the most unexpected love was the truest kind. They grew old together on their ranch, watching their children become adults and their grandchildren grow. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1928, surrounded by 3 generations of family who existed because 2 people had been brave enough to choose love over convention. And when their time finally came, many years later, they left behind a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of love, courage, and the simple truth that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are. Martha Reynolds, the widow who was mocked at 20, had become Martha Lawrence, a woman beloved by her family and respected by her community. And it had all started with a cowboy who looked at her and said 4 simple words that changed everything. "You are perfect to me." Those words had been the beginning of everything good in her life, the foundation of a love story that proved that redemption was always possible. that new beginnings were always available to those brave enough to reach for them. Martha had reached, and she had found more than she ever imagined possible. And so their story ended not with tragedy or loss, but with triumph and joy, with a life fully lived and a love fully realized. It was the happy ending Martha had stopped believing in during those dark days of her widowhood, but it had come nonetheless, proving that sometimes, against all odds, dreams really do come true.